Welcome to the EBFC show, the easier, better for construction podcast. I'm your host, Felipe Engineer Manriquez. This show is all about the business of construction. I love how every time I come on to Zoom, Vic, it never fails. Like they've done some kind of update and
Right.
they move the
Okay.
button. Literally, I could not find the record button. So like me, Vic, Mr. Technology, couldn't even find the record
Yeah.
button. But I want to start off by thanking you, Vic. You've come on to so many EBFC show episodes, and you've done a lot. You recently just awarded you were awarded the Lean Rockstar Award, and I will insert that video somewhere in this flow so that people can see you accepting your LCI Northern California Lean Rockstar Award. When I started my lean journey in California, I started in Southern California, and quickly I was able to take a full-time job and come up to this area in the Bay Area. And I got to meet you in person at an event, and it was like transformational. I met you and I was on the bus coincidentally with one of your partners when you from where you used to work before you were independent, and both of you were just phenomenal human beings. Phenomenal human beings. So I'm super appreciative. Everybody that I know that knows you just absolutely loves you, and everywhere I go, you get hugs and tons of appreciation for the work that you've done. It's tough work. Like nobody that does the type of work you do doesn't understand that firsthand. And so what I want to ask right out the gate, welcome you to the show, the one, the only rock star Victor Ortiz. What is the one thing about the frustrating part of our industry that still gets you excited to keep doing the work?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for lowering everybody's expectations like that. Can never live up to that introduction.
You already
Um,
live up to it. The lean rock star, like
oh my God.
I'm gonna loop the lean rock star awards thing in this
Oh,
opening so that
well,
while he's trying to downplay how awesome he is, you'll just see everybody had gathered together last month to give him a plaque.
well, recognition is a very kind thing to give, and of course it feels good, but one doesn't do this work for the recognition. There has to be something inside that drives us, that there's a desire to make things better, to do something with our lives that actually improves the world, improves an industry, improves a project, improves a team, improves relationships with our colleagues. We do those things, and that's the reward, really. And me now in our early part of my 75th year on Earth. I like to think, perhaps mistakenly, that I've learned something. I've certainly spent a lot of time trying to find people who know more than I do so I could learn from them. And luckily, that's always been a pretty easy thing to do because there are a lot of people who know a lot more than I do, and I just soak it up. So at this point in my life, having watched lean construction grow now from the 90s and having known Glenn and Greg, the founders, from the mid 80s when I worked with them, it's interesting to watch how, as generations develop and we go through things, that certain concepts, certain experiences that happened, maybe a few decades ago, can tend to get lost. We get caught up in studying tools and techniques and they're complicated. And so we tend to focus on those, and often we start to forget why we're doing those things, what the purpose of those things is. So back to your question about what's difficult, I think right from the beginning, my first job uh, with Strategic Project Solutions right around 2000, as that organization was going to implement lean construction, was to help with the idea of organizational change and why there was so bloody much resistance to any kind of change in the construction industry. And I struggle with that, certainly to this day, in trying to understand what the resistance is about. So that's the one thing that keeps me going is to say, there's a lot to understand when it comes to organizational change. to say nothing of industrial change. And we need to keep working at deepening our understanding about this stuff.
Yeah, and I'll say like many, many, many conversations you and I have had together, and I've told Victor, you are the ghost of Christmas future for me. Like, harking back to the Christmas Carol, because I see your life and I look at my life, and there's so many parallels. Like we have just somehow resonated on the same type of thing. And I've had the same exact struggle. Like I have an idea of how to do something different, using one of these lean construction techniques or tools, and I am amazed to this day at the resistance that people put up to having somebody help them do something. And it's just like incredible. Like I see it in my own family too. I think this is just part of the human condition, Victor, because this is so innate. Like I had a lot of quality time with the family this weekend, and at the end of the weekend, my son, like a good teenager, they're not designed to appreciate their parents. It's just the way that they're made. They don't naturally give appreciation. So as a parent, I find myself reminding them that, hey, these are the good things that we've done today. These are things that I appreciate. And I waited to see if he reciprocated, and he did not. He was not in a place to reciprocate. And I think in the construction industry too, like the work that we've done, and Vic has shared like tons of blog posts, interviews on my show, on the Lean Construction blog, with work at LCI. And we don't in the moment always get the appreciation that it's a nice to have. It's not why we do it. We don't do it because people come up to us and thank us. That almost never happens. But later, people will come up to us and say, hey, that thing you did really made a difference for me. Thank you. And sometimes it takes like 15 years until that thank you moment comes back. But I just want you to know, Vic, that as a brother in arms, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Well, maybe this is a good place to dive in and to talk a little bit about the fact that this presentation, this discussion that we're going to have is on what I've called 10 traditional construction misconceptions, things that we have thought for a long time and acted on for a long time that actually don't work all that well. And then what are 10 lean responses to this? And the interesting thing about this is that these misconceptions were not really put out somewhere as a manifesto. They just became clearer the more we tried to implement lean, the more we realized that the lean way of thinking contradicted other ways of thinking, other major concepts which had become um, just taken for granted in the construction industry. And as a person interested in psychology, one of the things I learned from an uncle of mine who was a psychiatrist way back when I was a teenager, he talked about how little of what we do is by conscious choice, that almost everything we do is either mimicking what people around us are doing or is based on some choice that we made a long time ago, some assumption that Todd Bell likes to call an underlying mental model, some construct that we have about how the world is, about how projects are, about how we need to be. And often that's so far back and has been repeated so many times in our behavior that we completely lose track of what it was that we were thinking. Um, so when you start trying to change, you realize that suddenly there's resistance inside us psychologically because it changes our underlying way, it challenges our underlying way of thinking. We go, wait a minute, that's what makes me feel secure. This is how I like it. This is what I think it is. And who are you to tell me that it's different? Who are you to tell me it's wrong? Or my God, may start thinking, holy cow, have I been wrong all this time? All of those things are unsettling. They cause what we'd call cognitive dissonance, friction inside us. And so we tend to be resistant at first. And the only thing that really helps, whether you're dealing with an addiction or an addiction to a practice in a project management sense, is to find something that works better and do it over and over again until you get good at it and you find that the choices that we make develop, turn into results. And if I make bad choices, I get bad results. And if I make good choices, I get good results. And so if I find a better way of doing something, it may be uncomfortable and clumsy in the beginning, but eventually it gets easier and the results become the reward. So that's important to understand about this whole process. But I think to do that, one has to start putting right out on the table what are some of the things we've always thought traditionally that are probably wrong, and what is the lean solutions that people know that, well, if that's wrong, all right, tell me what to do or tell me how to think, and that's we're going to try to touch on that in this conversation.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Um, so I guess building on this idea that I believe that people generally make the best decision they know how to make in life. And we in the construction industry have been doing what we've been doing because we thought it was the best thing to do traditionally. And the sad thing that makes us uncomfortable is that we still have a vast majority of, especially non-lean projects that end up over budget and late, that have quality problems, that have, litigation that end up with a long punch list and so on. And we all feel bad about that at some level. So we tell ourselves, well, that's just the way it is. And so this idea that if I can learn a better solution, make that choice to do that, make the choice of how I behave, what tools we use, and so on more conscious, we're going to get better results. So, all right. With that in mind, I've published on the Lean Construction blog, and I think we'll publish it. You said through your show here, a paper on 10 misconceptions, and um, the fact is that there are a lot of misconceptions, I think. I originally thought, well, I'll try to call it the top 10, but of course, who am I to say that these are the top 10? I think they're just 10 that are really important. Um, W. Edwards Deming said famously that no person can uh, perform better than the limits of the system in which they work allow. If you work in a system that's full of variation and unpredictability and a lot of people doing their own thing in their own way, uh, the chance that you can advance and perform better within a system that's not working very well gets really degraded. So Deming really suggests that we should look at the system in which we work, and that if people, instead of pointing fingers at each other, started pointing fingers at where the system breaks down and tried to fix it, we'd all be a hell of a lot better. And I think that's something that I really believe a lot. Greg Howell, who was one of the founders of Lean Construction, wrote a paper way back around late 90s with a guy named Laurie Koskela. They were trying to figure out why it was that we had all these late and over budget projects. What was it about project management practices that didn't work? And they went through the PMI manual, the PMBOK manual, and they were trying to figure out, is there some statement about a philosophy of construction, uh, a strategy and a philosophy of construction? And they couldn't find one, which was really interesting. It was full of what to do, but not why. It was, so they basically decided that it was time that we tried to make explicit a philosophy of construction, and that's a lot of what has been the underpinnings of the whole lean movement. So there we are. That's that's the introduction to this. Let's see if I can I need to get my slide to change here. Okay. Heck, yeah. So I put together these slides to go over the 10. And the way they're organized is we have a misconception. I thought you and I could talk about is that really a misconception and what does it cause? Because if it's a misconception, it probably causes results that we don't like. And then it's followed by a slide with some thoughts about how lean rethinks that, what lean suggests we should be doing, and how we should think about it. So we just talked about the relationship between choices and outcomes, um, and how the choices that we make really are what turn into our mental model. These choices, as they become less and less conscious, so we do them over and over again, become part of our underlying filters of how we understand what's going on. So we'll look at the 10 misconceptions and their consequences, and we'll identify 10 ways that lean counteracts them. So this is the assumption we've just been talking about. Where life is full of choices that we make over and over again. They get habitual, but our choices are based on our thoughts about reality, and most decisions that we make are largely unconscious. And the problem with that is that we lose the power of conscious choice when we do that. We don't examine things critically. We do it because that's how it's always been done. And in construction now, as well as being late and over budget, we have the highest suicide rate of any major industry sector. We have a poor reputation sometimes. We have a lot of trouble recruiting new people, young people to get into this, and there's a lot of safety problems. I mean, if those are the results we're getting, something needs to change. So we need better solutions to get better results. So here's number one. Are we ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
All
Still.
right. So here's here's the first misconception. And this comes from, I remember one of the last IPD coaching jobs that I had, talking with a construction project manager. And I said, we need to think about this project as though we're designing the project production system. And she looked at me, she said, this isn't a production system. This is a project. Production systems are in factories. They're not in a project. A project's a different beast. We're not the same. So the part of the underlying thought here is that, again, when you talk about a production system, it doesn't apply. And the challenge with that, of course, is that means that we don't have to examine what other industries have learned because we've set up a mental construct that we're a different animal. And so none of that could possibly apply to us. And we say, well, in this case, the project manager's logic was that each project is unique, each project is different. Each project has a different set of designers with different assumptions, and the players keep changing, sometimes mid-project. And so we don't have anything to learn. And the only thing we can do is focus on discrete trade specialized activities. And another thing that happens with that then, because, and we'll talk more about this in these 10 misconceptions, is that we tend to, because we're not thinking of the project as a production system that we can design and manage and run, we tend to blame the only thing we can blame if we're not looking at the system, which is each other. When something goes wrong, and sometimes it's something that initially went wrong in the design phase that we don't find out until we're in construction. It shows up in construction, and then construction is blamed, and construction management says, well, you contracted for this, so it must be your problem. And nobody fixes the system. We just get angry at each other and get defensive.
Same.
And when we
Yeah.
get defensive, we blame somebody else.
I saw the same thing. I don't know, when I first took a role as a lean manager a company ago, I was working with my friend Cromwell, and we were developing an A3 to figure out what is the reason and strategy why does this department exist? Why does this group exist? And what are we trying to do? And I remember one of the first executive reviews of our A3, Vic, we were trying to call it the company name production system. And an executive said, with vehement, like visceral anger, telling me that we're not a production system. We are a series of disconnected projects, and there's no learning that happens between them. And I didn't know it at the time. I knew it later when you had done some work with me about mental models, that we'd only ever be able to talk to this individual through the lens of their mental model. And they couldn't even see that we had projects through the work we were doing. We were already connecting projects at different key points to talk to each other and share lessons across the projects, not at the end when they were done, but while they were still happening. And it was the first year we took that learning to one of our clients. And the client said, with what you've done with us, this is the first time we've never had claims in a 12-month period because of the type of interactions we've had across projects, connecting them together, and them realizing that their portfolio for the owner on the owner side is a production system. So the client understood it. This executive never got there because
Yeah.
the mental model was so grooved in that we couldn't get there. And they enjoyed blaming people when things went wrong, even though they
Yeah.
were systematic.
It's the leadership style that has been modeled for them,
Yeah.
and again, I think it comes from the system. Well, let's take a look at what the lean alternative is, shall we?
Yeah. Let's look.
So here is some contrary thinking about this. So we're looking at project management as different from production management. That's a key distinction here that Glenn and Greg and people at SPS and others have come up with over time, is that we have a lot of project management practices and we don't have a lot of production management practices. So here's I think just kind of an obvious thing that gets overlooked with the fellow that you were talking about. If something gets produced, there must be a process or a production system to make it. If it's more than one step, there's a production process or system, and production systems are made up of multiple processes. Um, and we think, well, what gets produced? Well, right off the bat, a concept gets produced, a strategy for how you're going to run the project. Will it be design, bid, build? Will it be an integrated project delivery? Is it one? Will it involve construction people early in design? All of those kinds of decisions are actually products of some process of discussion, of thought, of weighing alternatives, hopefully of choosing by advantages in that. Uh, a procurement order, an actual purchase delivery, the installed materials on site, every one of those things is something that is produced by a work stream, by a set of activities. And so it's easy to see why people think that, it's obviously parts of it are factory systems. Parts of our supply chain definitely are producing things for us in factories. And there are many repeated processes. If you got multiple floors of rooms that you're fitting out, and they all need to have the same process of building walls and putting in infrastructure and so on. There are many repeated processes, but the line's not moving past us. We're moving past the line when we're doing it. So any process or system, once you realize that the process or system is a series of interlinked steps with interdependencies, any process can be improved and redesigned. But you have to understand it through the lens of a process or a system. So another thing is that operations science and lean principles apply to any production process. Once you start thinking about the project as a series of interlinked production processes, coming up with a plan is a production process. Anything that's a product has a process behind it. Um, we can start looking at a big project as a series of these production systems, and you can begin to build a model of what a project-based, instead of a factory-based, a project-based production system is. So our thinking is that we have to change and look at every project as a production system with many options for how we design the interdependent subsystems and how they work together. And that project management, rather than just providing a budget or a schedule, and we'll get to that, their job is to think about the project and encourage everybody to think about the project. So we've got a lot to learn from other industries.
Yeah, no, I'll interject. I think sometimes in project management, and I don't think this has ever been said, but we got the internet here, so tell us in the comments if I'm just making stuff up, tripping over here. But I think some project management people get into this mode, Vic, where they turn into like newscasters, where they're really good at telling you what happened. Like they're giving you the nightly news, like here's what happened today, but they can never tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. Like the weather forecast segment of the news at best can predict like 3 days reliably into the future. But because of how they're taking it like a newscast example, they can't tell me what we're doing with any kind of reliability 2 weeks from now or a month from now. But they can tell me how we're late, and they fail to recognize any patterns. Now, I say this all with having applied operation science and lean principles, and I know that you can't actually predict the future. You can't actually make reliable promises. These are things that we can do, and I know you're going to give me some nuggets there, but I think that this project management as a newscaster mental model is like pretty common and normal, and people accept it. Like owners even come to weekly owners meetings and they want a recap of the following week or a recap of the last month. And as like
Right.
as an owner, like I care more about when am I going to generate revenue at this building? When am I going to turn this like airport terminal over? When am I going to start being able to treat patients? When am I going to be able to have kids go to school here and take classes?
Mhm.
I don't care about what happened a month ago. And at the end of the job, that doesn't matter. Like all that newscaster reporting is waste.
Yeah. Yep. And we're going to get to that. That's another one of the 10, reliance on schedules and budgets. Right. So I think the main thing here is that most of us, part of why there's resistance, especially for people who've worked their way up into upper management, is that we have not been taught systems thinking. And many of us who go to construction like being in the moment, like banging out whatever it is we need to do, or pouring or setting or whatever we need to do because we're good at it and we like being in the moment and thinking systems, doing systems thinking doesn't come easily to us. So part of what we have in lean construction is tools to help make the processes and systems visible and accessible. So I do say that other industries have a lot to teach us. Um, and if we look to them and we say, okay, if you look at something like people say, well, we have nothing to learn from other industries. If you look at building a car, at designing and building a car, it is really not, except that the assembly process is mechanized differently. You have the same challenge of conceptualizing what you're trying to do and realizing that it has all kinds of interconnected components that have to somehow work together in the end. And those components are designed by people in different disciplines. And we're going to have to make procurement choices. And those procurement choices are going to affect the design choices. And when we get around to assembly, we're going to have to start looking at how the pieces really fit together and the tolerances and what is that's not different from construction. We do all of that all the time. And I kind of cut my teeth at Ford Motor Company back in the 80s, rethinking their product design system because the Japanese were designing cars in half the time we were in the United States. We had 65 months, they were at 30, 35 months, maybe 36 months, 3 years from concept development to the first car rolling off the assembly line. Obviously, they knew how to do something that we didn't. And they did it without building up vast car lots full of inventory that were unsold, that had cash tied up in them. So if you looked at what they were doing, I remember people at Ford saying, it's not possible. They can't possibly design a car in 3 years. It takes us six, and we know it takes six because we've been doing it for years, and it always takes us six. So that was the underlying mental model. So anyway, this is really the place to start, is that if we think that we have nothing to learn, we won't learn anything. If we know that There is a whole body of knowledge that's been developed since the 1950s, starting with people like Deming and Duran and total quality management, and going on into the whole lean process, and then now operations science. There's a whole body of knowledge about how to link operations that transforms the way we think about projects. Right? Okay, let's look at number two. Aha! What were we just talking about? Number two is the idea that the way managers and senior managers and people who control a project control is through schedules, budgets, and contracts. The schedule tells us all what we should be doing and when. Budgets tell us how much to spend, and the contracts are our promise, or it's how we think, at least, we've gotten control over what people are going to do. Because if they sign the contract, we're going to hold them liable for not following the contract, for not performing, and we'll be able to get some money back out of them or something like that. So, management professionals control through enforcement of contract schedules and budgets. And as you said, you don't know what to enforce if you don't look back at what went wrong. So we are driving looking backward. As we said, driving looking in the rearview mirror. Oh, something broke up. Now I got to go and demand that they make up for it. So another underlying assumption, because we think of management as controlling, is that construction workers, if they were left to their own devices, would run amok. That every sub would try to do whatever they could to get their work done, get the hell out of there, and try to save their margin. Um, we believe that contracts bind people to work as directed or as they bid. Um, and we usually try to control that not with more money because you're not supposed to spend more money. You bid already. So the only thing we do is threaten them with losing money, which means we develop a culture of threat and a culture of reaction and defensiveness. It also puts blame again on the workers, and the faults for this are never coming up to upper management. They're always on the performers because the contractors promised in their individual contracts to perform. And so it couldn't possibly be upper management's fault. It's the people down in the trenches. So we know that if schedules, budgets, and contracts is what Glenn and Greg came up with way back in the 90s, if they were really sufficient to control our production quality, schedule and budget performance, all of that stuff would be much better if this worked. And it's not that budgets, contracts, and schedules aren't important, but it's that the way we do them now doesn't work. And relying on them rather than getting people to collaborate doesn't work. So, any additional thoughts on this? This one seems fairly clear to me.
Yeah, and as clear as this is, like the typical practice is that people on a project team are not even familiar with what their contract entails. And I was talking to another consultant recently, and he said that the magic to how he navigates towards success is by helping people almost 100% put their energy into focusing on what the scope of the contract is. And he says, put the budget aside for a second, put the schedule aside for a second. When you get people just to focus on the what, which the contract typically spells out beautifully, all kinds of good things happen. And I said, I think some of that's probably like the Hawthorne effect, where if you focus on it, people know they're being looked at, it changes their behavior and they act better. And so like you have to just remind people like, hey, let's just read the contract. What's the scope? What scope did we actually buy? I find that when we don't do that, I've never walked onto a project where someone was naturally telling me what the contract included or did not include. What I find is a bunch of people moving in the swirl towards doing a lot of busy work that is mostly traditional, what they did in the last 15 projects versus focused on what this client actually wants. It's like it's amazing that the something as fundamental as scope is like very poorly understood.
Right.
And even from the design professionals, like they don't understand their contract either. And I've told owners on hard bid projects, like, unfortunately, you've set up a deal with the architect to hurry up and print something as fast as possible so that you can give it to me, the general contractor, to tell you all the places where your architect missed. And I'm
Hmm.
going to do that through a couple contract vehicles like requests for information, RFIs, or issues depending on what phase of the design we're in. And I was like, and that's just counterproductive. And this is why these collaborative contracts are totally different. Like I did a deep dive investigation with one of my CII research groups some years ago, Vic, and we actually did a macro contract deep dive where we looked at different types of predominant contracts in the industry, and we found that with few exceptions, most contracts don't even use the word collaboration.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
you know this. Like I'm preaching
yeah.
to the choir here.
Right. So what you're saying, this if we don't understand what our own scope is, how then are we ever going to be able to coordinate that scope with other people? And if they're all looking only at their scope and their contract requires them to get that scope done with a tiny profit margin because you're trying to win the bid, we'll talk more about that one. That's another misconception. Then everybody gets focused on watching their back and trying to get their work done. And that's the opposite of collaboration. So let's look at what Lean says. So this is again, kind of heady stuff, but we make a distinction between project controls such as schedules and budget. And if you think of if you're doing a medical gas system, for instance, in a hospital, putting that in, you're going to have valves and instruments that are measuring the content and the pressure and so on. Those things control the system. Those are controls. And the tools that we use, the contract and so on, are controls. That's project controls or system controls. It's not production control, which is the minute-to-minute management of the production process and activity. And certainly understanding scope is part of it, but then understanding how the scope broken down into areas and activities and batches of work interacts with the scope of everything that goes around it. Again, the car has to fit together. The suspension has to fit with the powertrain systems that ride in the suspension and so on. All of that stuff has to be coordinated and how that's going to be put together. So there's access to do each of the pieces that have to fit. The engine has to be tied in with the control systems, have to be tied in with a dashboard and driver's configuration. And that's the same stuff that's happening to us, except we don't call it out often unless we're using lean. So what happens when we have the senior management and what we've done is even worse. We have created professional territories. Schedulers do scheduling, finance people do budget, procurement people do procurement, thinking that by breaking these things apart and assigning them to people that we are controlling what's going to happen. But it doesn't. So Deming and the people who started total quality management way back in the 1950s into the 70s said that if you're on a production line, if you waited until the end of the line to find faults in the product, you would be wasting a huge amount of energy and building a whole lot of work that had to be redone as a work in process inventory. So I said, if what we're trying to do is create awareness of variance, what is variance from what is good, from what the scope tells us we should be doing, and so on, we should put control of the variance as close to where the variance happens as possible. And so Glenn and Greg, saw that people, when they're developing Last Planner, that the power and the schedule and everything was in the hands of people who weren't anywhere close to where the work was being done. And that if you wanted to change something like a schedule change happened, it would only be after that monthly owner conference where you were saying, well, we have to report that we're behind schedule. All right, now you got to update the schedule. Again, backward looking. So the idea of the last planner system is to put production management responsibility in the hands of the producers, not in some distant office somewhere. Uh, and then put those people together so that what changes one person does are immediately communicated in real time to what the other people are doing. And together they can continue to tweak the system and try to improve it. Um, so the focus becomes not on just my individual scope, but we get everybody thinking about how is the production system working? Are we meeting our deadlines? Are we keeping our people busy on the right tasks? Do we have the right number of people to do the right amount of work at the right time that meets the needs of the person who follows me so that they don't walk in and find something all screwed up? So we're focusing on creativity rather than compliance. And that's a huge mindset change.
Yeah, and I think the project controls what it was intended to do versus in current practice what it actually does is radically different than production control. Like I think a lot of people think that project controls would control the production, but because of their mental models, like we talked about in part one, it doesn't actually do that. Instead of controlling for what's happening, like you said, at the end of the month of 30 days later, they tell you, oh no, we're going to report we're behind schedule and we got to go do a recovery schedule. I've seen projects that are like trivially small, like $50 million. It can take them like 4 months to come up with a recovery schedule.
Yeah,
By the time they publish it 4 months later, the conditions are so radically different, it's invalid
right.
and it can't even work. I think project controls has devolved into just as building, just telling me like what happened. It
Yeah,
only
yeah,
tells me the past. Like you said with the rear view mirror, the project controls is a whole bunch of stuff on a dashboard, but it only tells me things that happened in the past. I'm not getting any real time data with typical project controls. And I have a project controls friend. I can hear you, Juan, yelling at me right now. I hear your voice, Juan, and it's not, you can't prove me otherwise. Like most of the things are telling people how we got here. They're not even telling me what we're pointed towards. We're not looking towards the future. And the production controls is just the opposite. And I'll say even like one of the biggest differentiators from production control versus project control is the data itself. We can have the same data set. And I learned this with working with James and Todd at SPS, like focusing on production rates. So we have the same data of like here's a start and end date and here's crew information. And we have that today. But now we're going to do one more thing. We're going to do one simple algebra equation. Simple algebra. And we're just going to figure out what rate of production do we have within this period with these people and what capacity do people have to actually maintain that rate.
right.
That,
So when we're talking about rates, we're talking about throughput, really. How when we've set in our work plan collaboratively in a last planner look ahead session what we're going to achieve by when. There is work to get that done. And if you're doing, again, a series of rooms or a series of footings or whatever it is that you're doing over and over again by areas, you can begin to really examine what does it take to do that and how can we get the parade of trades to think in a balanced kind of way. Deming said famously that in order to do continuous improvement, because we talk a lot about this, about doing plan, do, check, act, and do, and that was Deming's contribution, one of his many. Um, that if we just do continuous improvement, things would be well organized. What Deming said is that you have to have some theory about how a production system is supposed to work, or any system is supposed to work. How should it perform? At what rate should it put out? What should be the quality levels and so on? If you can't define that, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't know where it's breaking down. And if you can't know that stuff, how it's supposed to work and where it's not working, you can't do improvement. And we just go in there and look at stuff and say, well, we'll fix this, we'll fix that, without a sense of what are we learning about the whole flow of production, unless we go back to number one and think that stuff through.
yeah, I think you're spot on with this project controls needs to be that feedback loop. You got it right
Hmm.
there. TQM teaches us to put the control close to the point of variance. So
Hmm.
let's put a natural spot for people to get feedback and do that crucial adjust. in
right.
the PDCA. Like we forget to do that adjust. And adjust could be act, adjust, abandon, adopt, all actions you can take
Yeah,
based on real feedback of what's happening. And
yeah.
I think Vic, this is a good spot to pause.
Okay.
So let's just keep the slide here. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll pick it back up at about we'll take a 20-minute break and we'll come back at 9:20.
10:20.
9:20. I'm sorry, 10:20. Yeah. 10:20. 10:20. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can't pick it up and go back in time. let me
Yeah.
let
Great.
me let me I'm gonna stop.
That is transition.
Yeah. You want to change something on two? Just say what you want to change and I'll replace it.
Oh, well, I just want to start with finishing number two here,
Let's do it.
and then we'll go to three quickly.
Yeah, let me make sure that I think I'm conflict free. Yeah, I have a meeting start at 12:05.
Okay, let's
So we're
see what we
good.
can do.
Let's
Very
roll.
good. Yep. All right. All right. Well, so in conclusion on this idea of project controls, I did want to call attention for people who are using Last Planner or are learning about Last Planner, call attention to the fact that Northern California is going to have our first live training in the Last Planner system on the 20th of March of 26. Depending on when you're seeing this, that may be late, but we'll be doing more to talk about it. And one of the features of the Last Planner system is that all of the different trades who are doing work in a particular area who need to work together and work by one person releases work to another person are involved in cross-discipline thinking about how they're going to do work on a daily and weekly basis and looking ahead what has to be done to prepare them to be able to work. So they get to decide how many people are going to do what work at what pace to what level of quality in order to allow the next trade to come in and land running. Uh, so that's an important thing, and that really brings us to the next one here, which is that a next misconception is that design and construction are separate phases and with separate teams and separate contracts, and they're not tied to each other. Um, so this misconception goes, back centuries, where work was being done by stonemasons and carpenters and stained glass window creators and on, people who were very specialized. But you realize they were working closely together. They lived in a village. Their shops were close by. Even if stuff was quarried, the final fitting of stones, everything was done locally. They were seeing each other every day. They were working together. They were tweaking things as they went. So we have, um, with Taylorism starting in the 1930s and 40s, and with Ford, even before that, the idea became that if you wanted to get things done, you had people do repetitive jobs so they could get really good at a single task. And we thought that specializing and breaking the work structure down into specialized tasks and creating specialized experts for each one, like scheduling and budgeting and electrical and mechanical and on and on and on, was the way to go. And if they each were experts at what they would do, everything would magically fit together and work well. And what we know is that when architects now are charged with designing and they have their engineering consultants and so on, they think the design is theirs. And they guard their territory, often very closely. And they think that if we brought in construction people, that it would slow everything down and that they couldn't get the work done. Um, so the problem is when we get the design and engineering work done without construction input, if there are errors or if there are things that are difficult to build, it doesn't show up until construction generally. And then the constructors get blamed for not building something or having problems with it. We thought you knew how to do this, right? So, um, if we use the early involvement of constructions, uh, they think that this will explode the costs and the schedule and slow down design, and the designers will have to be explaining everything to these dumb construction people. And so there's also a fear that if you're doing design bid build, that if you got contractors involved early on, well, that would necessarily prejudice the bid process, and it wouldn't be fair and open anymore. So all of these things block us from talking uh, about the effects on construction of the design, or what construction could add to the design process. Have thoughts there, Felipe?
Yeah, I didn't learn about Frederick Winslow Taylor until I had my first industrial engineering class in university when I was just a wee little computer engineer in training before I went full on electrical engineering. And I remember at the time that the Tayloristic thinking was so like wrapped into the education. Like the instructors thought they were doing a really good thing by creating specialists and segregating
Mhm.
and separating. And then it wasn't until I got into the real quote unquote real world where we find that the errors and the friction points are in these in between areas where it used to be like this turnkey master builder type of concept where people were multi-craft, multi-skill, multi-trade and could design as well as build and do things simultaneously. Or a little more generalist, just to use basic terms. Like things have dramatically slowed down for the worse. Like we look at
Yeah,
the history of buildings from the early 1900s and where we do things now, and then you can contrast. There's still some examples like in shipbuilding where you have like this hard specialization with and but it also has devolved too with the specialization. So I think like we're in this area, like we're recognizing that there were some good ideas with Taylorism and then a lot of bad implementation. A lot of bad implementation.
yeah,
So and I think it's in that in between area where people lose the context of like how things actually do happen that you
yeah,
create a lot of issues. And like you said, like designers want to keep the design, but then I'll just pick structural engineers for an example. Structural engineers have no idea what AWS is, American Welding Standard. AWS is like a series of welds that you have to have like they'll know like they'll know big differences between a bolted connection and a full penetration weld as an example, like high level, but they don't specifically know like should this just be a fillet weld? Should this be like a 3/16? Should this be like back buttered? Like and all these different things that are in this other specialization. I've asked a lot of structural engineers on projects that I've been on, like, why are there so many RFIs around these welding things? Like, why is the contractor having to tell you and correct all of these things, or why have you just been blank on it? And they said, like, we don't learn it. I was like, but you're responsible for how the structure comes together, and these connections 100% will dictate how the building performs. Like, this is not
yeah,
trivial.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah. You're reminding me of Einstein's famous statement that we are all equally ignorant, but just about different things. And so when we're designing something really complex, a car, a building, or a bridge, or something else, the only way to get all this good experience is to get people together and look at it through the different lenses of the experience. And that we find that when we do that, we solve problems before they happen in the field, before we have made a bad purchase, before we have selected a bad contractor who doesn't have skill in what it is that we're going to need them to do. And if we don't get that amount of input that we need and collaborative decision making and design, then we end up with problems in the in downstream. And we know that every phase of the process, from concept to design to engineering to procurement to delivery to assembly and so on, the later the error is found, the price goes up about 10 times to fix it. So this is again a corollary misconception. Well, what does Lean say about this? Our thinking with Lean is that the job of design is not to be the owner of the design. It is to create a design process that creates the maximum value for the money available. And we know the first tenet of lean from uh, Leichert's book on lean um, is that value is defined by the customer. And one part of our challenge, of course, is that there's a zillion customers. Everybody who builds something and releases work for somebody else, that person they're releasing it for is a customer. They are going to use what you created. And of course, then there are all the users and the owners and the city and the inspectors. There's a zillion customers. So if we don't understand what's needed, the chances of meeting those needs are smaller. And that means that the job of thinking through this stuff in the beginning is complex. And as you said, people don't know what they don't know. So unless we get the stakeholders involved, then that's what we need to do. We're going to miss things if we don't do that. So early diverse expertise improves outcomes all the way through from concept to construction to handover. In the manufacturing area, whether you're building a car or a printer or whatever it is, whatever product you're doing, we started back in the 60s and 70s realizing that you could design things that were inherently hard to manufacture and hard to assemble. So they came up with this idea of designing for manufacturing and assembly, and that meant using things like creating parts that were very tightly controlled. The tolerances were controlled so they fit together. And sometimes if something could be put in reverse, you actually create a little chamfer or a little uh, notch or something that would mean that the part could only be put in one way. And the design of the part could communicate to the assembly people how things were supposed to be done. Uh, so that has, of course, expanded to design for X, X being fill in the blank here. And my friend Bart Huthwaite, who I met back in the early 80s, who was a master in product development design, talked about ilities and ings, and that in designing, what you should do is design for ilities, meaning capacities of things, constructability, usability, maintainability, etc., and get out the ings, which were process steps, buffing, adjusting, correcting, redoing, anything that had an ing on the end. You try to design to minimize those, and you'd reduce both the sunk immediate development costs and the life cycle costs of something, because you'd make things easy to repair and easy to replace and so on. So the challenge here is that we have to understand the diverse conditions of satisfaction for all these different stakeholders, and the only way to do that is to get them engaged. Um, and then we use things like set-based design, target value design. So we're trying to, again, figure out how much value we can get for the dollars that are available and what is needed, choosing by advantages. So the thing is, we want to manage design as a production process as well as the construction. The design produces concepts, designs, engineered specifications, agreements among the parties, and so on. So we think that design and construction are really important. And we know that most of the cost of a product is set by the nature of the design. If it's inherently hard to construct, if it's inherently difficult to adjust later in life and so on, the overall life cycle costs are set by the design. So we better understand that.
I completely agree. And those agreements about managing design as a production process with getting that input from the stakeholders is critical. And there are definitely nuanced ways to do it. And I can't say enough to plug the training you've done with how leadership shows up in meetings is a must for how to bring people together in a meaningful way. After that training, Vic, I was with a client and a contractor, and the owner had brought the contractor, it was a mechanical contractor, to a really early meeting in design. And the contractor had no idea why they were there. And I was
Yeah.
like, because you trained me, I said, the reason the owner is paying to have you here is not just for you to take up space on this chair, but to actually give the architect meaningful feedback on what they're thinking as their design is evolving. So I'm going to need you to start speaking up to every single thing that you see. And I'm going to call on you, Scott. So Scott was the person's name. It's like, I'm calling you by name to show you how to do it and when to do it. And we're going to lead by example. And then that totally transformed the meeting to the better. And they ended up saving time and uh, removed some unnecessary scope by just getting the feedback from the actual mechanical builder.
Yep.
So thank you, Vic. Just another thing
Yep.
for you.
Yep. That's just, and there are so many cases of this, oh my God.
We hear all the time that building enclosure is the #1 problem in construction. And when the task of the building enclosure is presented with so much pressure, it's something most of us would want to avoid. Until now, there has never been a course to teach someone how to manage a building enclosure. Building enclosure is a problem for every company, and the solution is often to ask someone within to try to find training or provide training to their teams to avoid these issues. Field Verified's enclosure management course is the answer to that problem. We learned the hard way, we've learned through failure, we've learned from others. This course, our team, will help those people who are assigned to manage the building enclosure be successful the first time so that they're spared some of the suffering and hardships that all of us went through. There's so much opportunity for a high return on investment, not just when an individual attends and all of the skills that they'll achieve, but when a team participates together, they can raise their level of performance by knowing what each other can do, what to expect, and they can raise the level of performance of that company as their careers excel and the company elevates along with them. The training is built on the science of how people learn. We capture all of the components that are necessary to master a skill. There's a hands-on component to the training where we're building a masonry mock-up, a metal panel mock-up, we're doing EFIS, and even installing a window that later you get to test. The hands-on training gives us the opportunity to translate the lines on paper to actual construction in the field. We always laugh because after the training, people come up and say, this isn't just about building enclosure. There's a lot of leadership in here. There are a lot of people skills. That's because those skills are necessary to be successful in building enclosure and in construction. We'd love to see you get started right away. We have lots of options available. They can come to us in person at Field Verified in Phoenix, or we can bring the entire operation to your facility and train up to 25 people at a time. And we've created an online training that's available for people who might not be able to attend in person. Go to the website and contact us. We're going to start by understanding what problems you're currently experiencing and develop a specific program that's right for the needs of your company.
So this is the lean alternative, and it leads us to a problem. You were talking about specialization and how the whole history comes from trades, and the people who are designing the contracts and who are developing the schedule and so on are not people who have done every single trade in detail and know exactly how things are to be done. So that leads us to number 4, which is means and methods are up to each subcontractor. The assumption is senior management couldn't possibly know we're hiring these people based on their bids because they're going to convince us that they know what they're doing and they can do their part of the project. And so we're right back to the old idea of the skilled artisans and master builders. So when we have this expanded now into our current way of working, then each contractor has their own trailer. So we're separating them not only by discipline, but physically celebrating. They have their own schedules that they bring in. One of the big mistakes in the last planner is that people come in and they tell the trades to bring in their schedule, and then everybody puts their schedule on the wall and they try to mash it together. But they don't really talk about means and methods and how many people and how fast are you going to work and how much work are you going to get done before the next trade can come in and get started, and what would that look like. They're just scheduling, not actually managing production. So the idea is that if you have this all divided up, then when things go wrong, somebody's got to figure out who screwed up. And then we go back into the separate trailers, and whoever followed and found that there was an error blames the other person, and they try to defend themselves and blame the architect or blame the supplier or whatever. So this doesn't help us actually work together. And the management, the good thing, what's the win for management in this is they saying that they can't micromanage this. This means that they can absolve themselves of responsibility for the fact that things don't fit together or fall apart, because after all, the contract says the means and methods are up to each sub, and therefore, it ain't my fault, not my problem. So uh, this is where this happened in the auto industry back in the 80s. They realized that they had to get cross-functional teams with everybody who had a component area of the automobile or truck to design to be together in the same rooms. That one tweak in a design that might affect somebody else was immediately picked up before it showed up on the factory floor or in a vehicle recall 2 years later, something like that, or 5 years later in this case. So anyway, that's the thought here, and so we think that means, and if we think about the lean solution to this, that all of this production, just like you have people standing in line on the assembly line, we're moving trade after trade after trade. We have the parade of trades. And the system has to be co-created so that if I'm doing work for you, Felipe, before you, I know what you need in order to be able to come in and do your work without me having to come back and interrupt your work and fix something that I screwed up because I didn't know you needed that. So we have to define, measure, and improve all of the work streams together. And that's what the last planner system is designed to do. So means and methods are everybody's business. And by looking at and understanding means and methods, we know, I'm sure you've heard it many times, somebody says, wait, you do it like that? I didn't know you do it like that. Well, I'll change this. And suddenly things start flowing better. So the whole goal of this is that we want to have the right people in the right place at the right time, doing the right amount of work to the conditions of satisfaction of the people that follow them, so that everything can flow smoothly. And that way, it's not enough to just come put my schedule on the wall and say, well, I hope that works for you because it's what I need. We develop things together. And then we can develop standard work streams as well, because there's all kinds of things that are repeated in different ways, framing and roughing in a room, or creating footings for pilings, or, digging trenches and laying in electrical work or plumbing. All of that stuff gets repeated as we move along in the work with minor variations. If you're doing this only with Post-it notes, you end up rewriting Post-it notes a million times. But with modern software, you can now create a library of standard practices, standard processes that you can tweak slightly depending on the size and the volume of work or other conditions, but the same flow of steps can be used and tweaked and improved as you go along.
Yeah, and Agile speak, we call this a shared definition of done.
Yeah.
So like this condition of satisfaction that you mentioned, as well as having these standards, those things together are exactly what is meant by a shared definition of done. So that is like if you and I are working together as you finish something, it's to the right level of what I need at the right quality in a way that I can accept and pick up and keep going. And we work that out. I always tell people, like, it takes us longer to explain what it is than for how people actually do it. When you create an environment like a last planner meeting where people do it in a conversation, talk about it with their shared experiences, and they get into this like collective mindset where they have a common agreement, and they now shift into a shared mental model, which the project starts to become the thing that we're doing together, not this thing that I show up to do individually.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a corollary to this, which is the use of earned value analysis. And people will do all the work that they can in order to bill for earned value, but they're missing some key part, or there's some work that still needs to be done before the system they're working on is done. So you'd say, well, are you done? Oh, we're 90% done. But the system itself is unusable if it's 90% done. So we say, well, is it done or is it done? Is it really done?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what we're trying to avoid here. So again, the idea that means and methods are only the business of the sub just invites us to optimize subsystems and sub-optimize the whole system, and that's what we're trying to avoid. All right, let's look at misconception number 5. This should be familiar. The lowest bid equals the lowest final cost. All of us who've lived with design, build, bid, build, and work in the public sector where this has been the case for a long time, where they're forced to take the lowest bid, regardless of what the quality of work is of that lowest bidder. This is really a sad thing. It's just wrong in so many ways. So the assumption and the misconception is that we can hold people to their original bid in order to contain cost, regardless of whether the overall system actually allows them to succeed. And again, top leaders are separate from this. The contract was accepted. People said they could do it. So top management is not responsible in their own minds from doing this. They've got to try to protect the owner from the failures of the subcontractors and so on. So it leads to a lot of wasted time blaming and gaming for a system that's not in control. And if instead of looking at who screwed up, we said, wow, where's the system failing? Where is our production process falling apart or missing something? And we correct that, then we recover and we don't have to make that mistake again. And we don't have a pissed off contractor.
And people think that this strategy, this mental model this is the right way to mitigate risk. And I've told the owners that I work with too, like when you set things up this way where you're trying to get the lowest qualified price, all you actually focus on is the lowest price. You forget the qualified, that word qualified gets totally ignored.
Right.
It's not validated. And then you end up getting much less than what you paid for because you're going to inevitably have changes. And if you're missing these different processes to deal with this, because the conditions change. And as you've said in the previous 4 things, like this is systemic. I think now as we're getting through number 5, Vic, I'm seeing there's an interconnection. And I would dare say that you have like in mind why these 10 things show up in this order, even though you said that they're all important. Like I feel like they build on each other and this feels designed.
Yeah, well, thank you. What I found out as I was starting to put this together, I was thinking, well, should I call it the top 10 and should I put it in order from least important to most important or other way around? And then what I realized as I was writing this up is that all of these things overlap. And we're right back to number 1, which is whole systems thinking. Everything affects everything else. So, if you're trying to get people to collaborate and it's a design, bid, build project, and leadership doesn't understand the idea of production management or getting people to work together, your chances of getting this work done in a smooth flow and without problems has been greatly reduced by this misconception. So what do we do about that?
Yeah.
What does Lean do about it? So the main thing here, this goes back to the design and construction input. The idea is we focus on creating value within a target cost and eliminating waste, which means that when we're finding partners to be in this project with, we want to know people who have the capabilities. So we want to look for people with the greatest skill, agility, knowledge, familiarity with Lean, and so on to work with because they're going to be able to work with us rather than against us to get these things done. And then we want people who know how to define, measure, and improve the work streams that we have. So if you hire somebody who's never done Lean before and you don't have a system in place to train them and so on, they're going to be an anchor on the whole process. And you're going to be going over this discussion about how our thinking has changed, why we're doing something differently here over and over again. You and I have been there and done that. So these new forms of contracting, IPD and integrated project delivery and the integrated form of agreement contracts are set up to try to align goals. And people put the expected profit into a pool and they set goals together and they hope to beat the goals and have more money in the pool and share that at the at the end. So if your contracting process creates incentives to not work together and to everybody watch out for themselves, again, the system is not designed for success at that point. So what we want to do is develop conditions, the coalitions of trades. And what we see in hospital systems in Northern California now is major hospital systems or say in the area of developing, um, uh, well, what am I thinking? The computer
Data centers.
data centers, yeah, where people are doing it over and over again. You start finding people who know how to do the work, you use them over and over again. And if you find that there are certain people who have worked together and teams of people who have worked together over and over again, um, they will give you more value for the time. They will spend less time needing to be trained, more time focused on improving the system and being expert at it because they know that improves their competitive advantage in the future. So we're looking for the people who are the best, not the cheapest. And the thing to do is if they perform for you then is reward them with more work. All right. Let's move to number 6. We're halfway through these.
Yes.
Yep. Here's another common idea. How many times have you been in a situation where schedule is slipping and everybody says we need more people?
Every time.
Yep.
Every single time. And in software, Vic, they call it Brooks Law. And Brooks
Mhm.
Law says adding people to a project that's late makes it later.
That's right. And why is that? Well, uh, first of all, you get more people working in the same area out of sequence, doing a volume of work that wasn't agreed, the implications of which have not been defined. And so people are getting in each other's way. People are making assumptions because they're trying to get their scope of work done, as we were talking about in the contract, rather than getting the project system completed, which includes their scopes of work. So when trades struggle to meet obligations, they take care of themselves first and they can crowd out other people. They can put their supplies where other people need to work. And as a consequence of this, to them, they can claim more billable hours. So while they're screwing up the process, they're making money on it. And that's a perverse system. And again, top leaders are not necessarily responsible for the trade effect. So if the trades come in with change orders and so on, they have to blame somebody in order to justify the change order. Again, if we were only focusing on how to make the system as excellent as it could possibly be, we would avoid, like 99% of this kind of friction in the system, this kind of system noise that just soaks up energy and money. So when we do this, the result is change orders fly and costs increase, safety and quality suffer. Can I get an amen?
Amen, brother. And I'll say too that this misbelief also forces teams to, on purpose, with bad consequences, put too much work in progress
Right.
because they think that more people busy is better.
That's right. And again, the focus is on tasks and billable hours and so on, not on how is our production system performing and what do we need to do to increase, as you were talking about, throughput to make things flow and get more work done with only the right amount of people in the right sequence at the right time in order to save us all money and frustration and lawyers' fees and all of that. Right? So, what does Lean say about it? Well, that right from the beginning, if you do an IPD project, there should be an execution strategy, which is all of the major parties getting together and talking about, well, so are we using Lean? What kind of contract are we going to do? Are we going to try to link in suppliers and get just-in-time supply? Are we going to work really hard at Last Planner in order to make this a reliable flow? So what techniques are we going to use? And then we have to design a production system that fits the product. So how is this thing going to be built? What areas are built in what sequence? And we try not to overstaff, but improve the process in order to have the right sized staff and guard both the target price and the profit margins of everybody. So you have to train everybody in lean practices and in the concepts of continuous improvement and process design, which can be done on the job. I know you do that a lot.
Mm.
Uh, and that, that's where senior management's part comes in, really, in providing the resources, the direction, and the support so that the system can be continuously improved and work better and designed well from the beginning.
And I'll say for anybody watching this, like, don't skip this. Even if it's the team's second project, people still come and go from the team. You need to do training on every single project. I'm working with some really big, lean, experienced clients, Victor.
Hmm.
They on downstream projects, they skip this training and they make assumptions that people just know exactly how to behave, and then they get in trouble because nobody was onboarded and their own team doesn't know what the expectation is because they just assume that people know because the banner, the logo is a certain color, and it's just not the case. You
Yeah,
got to still onboard people into these practices because these are not like these are not like traditional practices. These are still 30 years later alternative ways of working.
that's right. That's right. So I think the lesson from this is if you're on a project and somebody's raising the flag that the uh, schedule is slipping or the budget is being busted, and they want to speed up the work, often the counterintuitive thing to do is stop and figure out what the heck is broken, rather than throwing more people to work in the broken system. And
Absolutely.
that's where, anyone can stand up and say that. Yeah, you might not be popular, but
You will not be
that's
popular.
that's the truth.
You will be you'll be wearing a scarlet letter with a big S for
Yeah.
for schedule schedule.
Yep. All righty. Number 7 goes along with this stuff. Another one. Get your materials and equipment on site as quickly as you can, as soon as possible. Right. And why do we do that, Felipe?
Because people think that having it on site is better for control.
Right. So we have this idea that it's better to have it and not need it than it is to need it and not have it, right?
That's right.
And what we're really saying is that we don't trust the supply chain, and we don't trust the engineering, and we don't trust the procurement department. Uh, Partly we don't trust it because A, we've had experience of things getting busted, and B, we don't feel like we have any control or influence over it. So the only thing we can do is add buffers and material and so on. Well, what happens to buffers and material? I remember working on a replacement of a nuclear power plant with a gas cogen plant in Northern California. And because of the price of steel possibly going up, the thought was, let's get all of, I mean, there were miles and miles of piping in this thing, high pressure steam, expensive steel piping. And there was a field out in the near the head shed and where the work was going, where all of this pre-ordered steel spools of pipe got put together. Well, of course, what they hadn't thought out was that when the construction ramped up, people needed a place to park. And the only place to put a parking lot was where all the steel was stored. So now everything had to be moved. And when everything was moved, the order in which it was placed and so on got mixed up. And sometimes people looked and said, oh, there's a spool that we could use over here because we're late and we need to complete this bit of work. So then they would screw up somebody else's work by pilfering a spool of pipe or several spools or a valve or an instrument or whatever. Um, so one of the things we've found, one of my pet peeves with people who put together Last Planner is that as they're doing Last Planner, they try to identify constraints, and often those constraints have to do with the delivery of a piece of equipment or material, and they assign it to somebody to make sure that happens. But what it's really showing us is that the supply of materials and equipment that we need uh, is considered outside of the production system rather than supply chains and delivery systems and so on being a larger part. It's a subsystem of the larger production system. And if we can't define the production system, then we really cannot. There's a limit on how much control we can put on the work that we're doing. We can control a site, but then the reasons for non-completion all run upstream to engineering and to procurement and to delivery of materials and mishandling or lost materials and so on. Uh, so I remember working on again on another big project out in an oil field, and there were some late things, and we kept saying, well, why don't you guys bring in your procurement people so that they know what the plan is, that they're part of the last planner system, and they can let us know if stuff's going to be late or not. And I said, no, we don't control them, and they're off in a different office. They're not on site. It would be too costly to bring them out. And then, of course, things weren't procured on time, and the cost of work being disrupted and systems not being completed was much higher than it would have been to engage them in some way. So this is again, when people say we've got to get it there, um, this is a real problem that it should flag to you that we need to do something different. And what is it that we should do differently? Well, we think that material and equipment flows are the same, as just as much importance as installation flows, because they feed the installation. Glenn and Greg came up with this idea that we need to shield the work that's happening on site, the installation work, by having a make-ready process. And the make-ready process, if you're using modern software, that's good modern software, you can create work streams for things. So in building data centers, for instance, I worked on a project where we were working with the factory that made all the power equipment, the feeds and the switch controls and so on for each of these big lines of computers. And when you start looking at that, or say air handling systems for something like that, you find out that the lead time in ordering is much longer than the actual value added time of producing and shipping the stuff. And you ask the people in the factories, why do you have a 4-month, 5-month lead time on an air handler when in fact you produce these things in a matter of hours once you get going? And they say, well, because if we produce the things for you, we don't trust that you're not going to change the specifications and ask us to produce something else. So they are responding to our unreliability by adding time and stuff to force us to make decisions before we know exactly what we're going to need to make.
Mm-hmm.
And the system is in a perverse loop of unreliability because we don't trust each other. We don't trust each other because we don't have a system that allows us to coordinate workflows. Other industries have had to solve this. They've had to bring in as partners their suppliers and their offsite manufacturing in order to create just-in-time delivery. And when you have reliable just-in-time delivery, you don't have to have big stores of equipment around. The worksite becomes safer, stuff doesn't get damaged, things don't get pilfered, and so on. And your costs and your time are reduced.
Love it.
Yep. So if we can improve the accuracy of our demand in the field, Glenn and Greg found, you can create a more agile and responsive supply chain. I remember working on Terminal 5, working with O'Rourke. They had a precast concrete plant. One of the problems was that they only knew how to order rebar that was going into the precast concrete in large batches. Turned out when we started talking to the suppliers, they were able to make milk runs of exactly the rebar that was needed, within half day of when it was needed. And then if we made the production schedule of precast elements for things like parking garages, things like that, stairwells and so on, it could all be done with a tiny percentage of the inventory that they'd had. And if we could get the schedule right, a whole big parking lot full of precast elements that were waiting to be shipped to projects got reduced to almost nothing because When you were done with something, it went out on the lorry and went right to the project that it was needed just when it was needed. The management of the company freaked out because they were used to driving into their precast area and their administrative offices and seeing a huge parking lot full of precast pieces sitting on flatbeds and thinking this was a sign that they were being productive. So again, a change in mindset. All right. I hope that makes sense to people. So again, if you're running into people saying we got to get the stuff on site, that's a sign that your procurement and your supply chain is out of control. And usually, again, our specialized thinking is that those people are outside our control. But it's actually better for them if we can bring them in and coordinate things because then they know when they need to make things and their production schedule doesn't have to be buffered so much.
Very true.
Yep. All right. Getting there.
So
All
Vic,
right. Here's,
let me pause before you start eight.
yep.
I need to do the opposite of a milk run. I need to do a milk deposit. Let me step to the back. I'll be right back.
All right. Let's go back to
Give me-
7 and we'll
give me-
pick up there when you're back.
5 minutes.
Yep.
All right, I'm back. Thank you so much for letting me take that quick, necessary biology break.
Yeah. Good. Well, while we were talking about this, so just to finish this idea on just-in-time delivery, I remember working with, again, a builder of big data centers. And one of the key pieces of equipment was switchgear equipment. And the factory that made their switchgear equipment, and they're building data centers all over the United States, a lot of them in the Bay Area. If they needed to know that they had the switchgear when they needed it because of all of the follow-on work and testing that happened afterwards. And in order for that to be ready, the place outside of the actual data center where the switchgear fit all had to be ready and completed. So if we could get that assembly process, the building and construction process, in control so that we knew when we needed to do stuff. Then what we did is we made a process map going backwards from, say, we needed a switchgear on site ready for delivery to be installed on the 28th of February. We'd go back and say, well, where is the site? What is the shipping time? And we'd plug in the shipping time so that we knew exactly how long it would take. And then in order to get it shipped, you had to have it completed and packaged and ready to go on the shipping. Before it could be packaged, it had to be assembled. Before it was assembled, it had to be, all the parts had to be put together. We looked back and looked at the value added time and how did we reduce any time for any of that stuff sitting around waiting for the next step. And we realized that the whole process could be done. The whole assembly took about 3 days on site. And they'd build a frame and then they'd put all the components in, all the wiring and everything. We got that nailed down to about 3 days and then the shipping. And so you could back that up and you could put a work stream for every, and this was a standard process, right? So you could put a work stream into your last planner system for each of these big switchgear equipment. Same thing with air handlers. If you knew how and agreed with the supplier how this was going to go. And they were perfectly capable of doing that. So you really could create just-in-time delivery of these things. And you also then shortened the amount of time between order and payment. So you didn't have to pay way in advance and hurt your cash flow. So these things are possible. And they should be done because otherwise we're creating waste, right?
Right.
All right. So here's another favorite I know of yours. With the specialization of schedule and the idea that the schedule has to be done in excruciating detail in order to get an accurate bid from the contractor so that we can hold the contractor's feet to the fire and that everybody's dealing with the same amount of detail. There is a myth that the more detailed the master schedule, the more accurate the production control, as if the schedule controlled the production. You and I have already talked about how once a schedule is done, The only way it gets adjusted is when something is proven to not work, which is after the fact. And the production is moving forward, and the schedule is adjustment is looking backwards. And the more distant the scheduler is from where the work is being done, the more time and delay is being put in place. And then they have to send that to the contracts people and the finance people to see how much more money that's going to cost, and then that's going to be objected to. And it's a whole falderall of activity that really we shouldn't be doing at all. So again, this goes back to the idea that schedules and budgets and so on actually control production, and they don't. Um,
Thank you for
so
saying it out loud.
yeah, they give us some targets, but when the superintendent shows up or the foreman shows up and two of his crew members are missing and he's got to catch up on stuff, or somebody hasn't released the area where they were going to go work and he's got to do something with the five people who did show up. Things they're going to do what they got to do to get work done. And so our reliability and our goes down, our variability goes up, and everybody gets tense. So there's another assumption that that scheduling is difficult, and therefore you need a college-educated scheduling pro sitting at software somewhere to do this, rather than the people who are actually doing the work, who really know how it goes. And again, if we ascribe means and methods to the contractors, then how is the scheduler really going to get an accurate schedule? So they have to make assumptions based on past experience rather than us working together to figure out how to do things better.
Yeah, I think this just becomes like that Hollywood effect where you can make it look good for the camera, but then when you try to open up the front door, you realize it's just all stucco and facade, and
Yeah,
there's no real structure
yeah.
behind.
There's 2x4 frames holding up the wall on
Exactly.
the inside of the
And that's
set.
what really detailed schedules look like. They
Yeah,
look like, the more activities you have. And I know from going to scheduling conferences and talking to attorneys that once a schedule gets past 2,000 activities, it actually starts to become detrimental to update and becomes near worthless.
yeah.
2,000 activities is not that much.
No. And modern last planning software can handle that kind of stuff quite a bit. You've got a master schedule and we're adding detail under that. And if we properly link all of the tasks so we know what the dependencies are, as soon as one thing slips, it starts showing up in the whole chain down or upstream, downstream chain of activities that are affected by that slip. And we can be much more agile and responsive to making adjustments and so on.
Yeah.
Uh,
What does
so,
Lean say about this, Vic?
pardon?
What does
What
Lean
does
say?
Lean say about this? Well, I wonder. So the the lean alternative to schedule detail like this is that we work at different levels of planning. And you have to start right from the beginning. We talked about having an execution strategy for the project, which starts right at the same time we're doing concept development. If we use this concept, what does that imply for how it gets built? If we use that concept, what does that apply? And you need to start thinking about how we're going to work at the same time that you're doing what we're going to work on. So we think about a difference between scheduling, which is putting things on a calendar, from managing production in real time. And I have seen, as we started with Last Planner, and people thought Last Planner was just the weekly work planning and maybe a little look ahead planning with Post-it notes. And the Post-it notes got cumbersome. People developed software to automate the Post-it note process. And then people would come in with their schedules, each trade, and they'd sit in a room and they'd put up their schedules, and they would never talk about the interdependencies or how much work or how is this going to flow. And they would agree to a week's worth of work because all these were put in on a calendar, so that told you what the week was. And I said, well, if I could see my work there, then I guess I can say yes, without realizing that there were things that other people needed to do in advance of me that, if they didn't do it, I wouldn't be able to say yes. So we think it's important for people to learn the last planner system, and that the increment of work for most work. It's daily, not weekly. We have daily huddles where people are doing, I know you talk about Scrum activity or looking at what we did, did we do more than we thought we could do? Could we do more? Should we change that? Did we do less? What was obstructing us? And that affects the weekly work plan, and the weekly work plan dictates what is completed so we can now plan in our look ahead planning with more accuracy and so on.
We had
And
a
that
we had a
affects,
debate about this, Vic. I have you chime in and settle the
yeah.
argument. So, two production managers and myself were talking to a production lead at a company that I'll let it be anonymous just to protect the guilty. And they were making the case like, well, one person was saying it's not practical in the daily check-in to talk about what you actually accomplished. That people do it just once a week, and once a week was good enough. And I was in the camp with the production manager saying best practice is to do it every day. Where would you fall in this?
Well, some of the very early stuff and company that you now work for was involved in this. We started developing the mechanized last planner system and all of this way back in the late 90s um, with paper mills in the state of Wisconsin. And what we were doing was not big long things. We were doing maintenance turnarounds where every minute that a huge paper making machine was down for routine maintenance, tons of money was being lost from lost production. And these processes were disastrously unpredictable. So you'd set aside 2 days for a big maintenance turnaround, and a week later they'd be finishing it up, and millions of dollars could have been lost. Same thing in oil plants and things like that. Anything chemical plants, pharmaceutical, you have downtime for these kinds of things. If they're not really tight, it's a major cost bust. So we actually were doing on like 4 hour, it was 24-hour plans, and we were actually checking how everything was going every 4 to 6 hours on those things and making adjustments to the plan and seeing if there was something we had to speed up in order to allow for what we just lost. Uh, and people could do that. So I'm definitely on the daily huddle plan because the people who the foreman say who's responsible for work in the field doesn't want to wait to report that we screwed something up and we're late, and now we have to go back and adjust the whole 6 week look ahead and maybe the phase plan because we screwed something up. If we could have known about it on Tuesday and gotten it fixed by Thursday and gotten back on track.
Yes.
But the huddle needs to be focused not on who screwed up, but is our plan doable? Did we discover that there was some constraint we forgot to identify? And is that a manageable constraint? Is that recoverable or not? And the sooner you know that and the sooner you report, the better. In the water softening plant that I worked in, after the daily huddle, the foreman would come in and update the plan every night before they went home with our people who were using SBS Production Manager at that time. So the quicker you're doing it, the more agile you are, and the less time is lost in making corrections.
I love that answer. Thank you, Vic. I'm going to take that back and settle the debate once and for all.
Yeah. And then they can say, who the hell said that?
I was like, Vic said. It's
Yeah,
like
who the hell
it's
is
not
he?
me saying it, it's Vic
Yeah,
saying it.
yeah. Well, we learned this all the hard way. We'd keep
Yeah.
trying to get things to work smoothly and something would fall apart, and we realized that we had to tighten up production control somehow. And
Mhm.
the sooner we could learn that something wasn't what we had thought it was going to be when we committed the weekly work plan, say on a Friday afternoon, the faster we learned that didn't work, the faster we could make corrections and the less problem it caused. I mean, it was just as simple as that. But again, we do backward pass planning. When we were doing, like, say, the 6 week look ahead, which gave us the weekly work plan, One of the things we did is we would go backward from what needed to be done and make sure that the timing of everything would still support the work plan. And we'd plan backwards. And, so if I'm going to do this, if I need to get this done, what do I need from you before me? And when can you release this to me so I can get my work done? And we'd plan out the way the work would flow and then see where that fit in the calendar. And if we were behind, we'd have to make adjustments. If we were ahead, we'd decide, do we start work now and try to pull the whole project forward or not? So the backward pass with tightly coupled work is what allowed us to see what was going to happen. And it would squeeze buffers out of the work that weren't needed and put them towards the end of a phase or towards the end of the project, where we'd have time if there was something found later than we wish we'd found it, we could use that buffer productively, or we could move the whole project ahead.
I just lived this last week, and we were planning an area. We took a schedule and we were breaking it down by areas on the floor, and contractors were coming guns blazing with buffers up the yin yang. And I said, I was like, I've prepared. Here's the picture. Here's the floor plan. Here's the 3D model so you can see it. And then here's the space. It's 5,000 square feet. Does your 2 weeks that you're saying for this scope of work make sense for 5,000 square feet? And the foreman's like, no, it's only going to take me 4 days. Sorry. I was like, no, it's not. You don't have to feel bad. I was like, you've been so conditioned to have to pad everything up with contingencies because you get bad handoffs
Yeah.
and just straight lied to because
Yeah.
that's the system we work in. I was like, that's why I came prepared with here's the picture, here's the square footage, these are the areas, this is how we're going to enter the area. We have the whole logistics plan tuned in so they can understand like how they're going to walk in, how they're walking out, where's the trash leaving. Like we had all that figured out ahead of time so that they can just focus on, okay, I can actually just come and work.
Yeah.
I was like, it's what a novel concept.
Yep. Greg Howell used to say, because people would put anything down on a post-it and put it up there. And he'd say, well, there need to be some ground rules about this. And he created what he called the three S's, which were size, sequence, and soundness. And the idea is if you put something up and you're going to commit to it, is it the right batch size of work? Is it the right amount of work to be done in the time that fits with everybody else's needs? Is it in the right sequence? Do we know what has to happen before and what it releases afterwards? And is it sound? In other words, have we done the constraint analysis? Is our supply chain, our equipment, our personnel planning, all the things that could keep us from keeping our commitment, are those things in order? And you couldn't say yes. The rule is you could not say yes if it wasn't the right size of work that you were committing to in the right sequence. And we could say with reasonable certainty that all the things we needed to do this were soundly in place. And these are things that get lost, over the years of doing Last Planner, these simple little things, but we developed them because Last Planner wasn't working if you didn't fix this. And then we'd fix that, and the next problem would show up, and then we'd have to go fix that. All righty. So the idea is, again, the people who are doing the work on the site are the last planners. They're the people who control who's going to work on what. And if we get that in control, it will expose all kinds of things upstream that aren't in control, and we'll fix those. And pretty soon you'll have a pretty good production system. All right, let's look at number 9. This is a subset of means and methods. Subcontractors own the people issues. And you think, if you've got a good team on and your subcontractor has another project that's going south, who controls whether they take their foreman and crew off your project and dump it on another project? And if somebody shows up, somebody's got a drinking problem, or somebody's depressed, or somebody's angry and frustrated, well, they're under the thumb of the contractor, and therefore it's their job. Again, senior management gets to absolve itself of the job of creating a productive culture. And we know that means that nobody's, when you don't have somebody responsible, nobody's responsible. So when you have a lot of people working, and every subcontractor on the job comes from their own company, and therefore their own company has their culture. And now they're in this position of, do I respond to my boss back at the home office, or do I respond to the project? And so there's a big challenge of getting people to think of our project as a community, that we are a group of people, a family of people. We're going to go create something great, and we're going to look out for each other and help each other. And if those aren't the values of the leaders, then you're going to have a lot of trouble doing it. So what's the solution? Well, we need to think of each project again as a unique ad hoc multi-party enterprise. And the people who are inviting to be our partners in this enterprise need to have systems and culture and norms and a sense of community that supports the enterprise. And that takes effort to create it. So it takes leadership skill at every level. And that's why we have the high performance leadership training that we've done, because a worker at the lowest level on a crew sees something wrong, can speak up and take care of a safety issue or make a process improvement. And if they don't feel empowered to speak up, then that error is going to go uncorrected and cause problems down the line. We want just-in-time correction, all we can get. So senior leadership needs to know that they either set or constrain the project culture by their behavior. And respect for people, which is now a big issue in lean construction, is demonstrated by leadership and what they focus on. And again, if leadership is focused on holding people to their contracts rather than creating an environment with really highly effective production systems, then they're going to have problems. And the message about thinking about how do we enable people rather than how do we control people, if that's not the tone of the senior leadership, then again, we're fighting an uphill battle. So again, this is why like in Northern California, some of our big hospital systems and others, seeing the success of others in using lean principles and lean capable contractors, are forming these consortiums of teams that work together over and over again, that know each other, that know the processes, that know the software they're going to use to run a project, and have a sense of how this is going to go. And that's how you create high performance teams, is getting people to work and calling out these issues early.
Yes.
So people issues are everybody's issue, in other words. And I would say one last thing about respect for people. You can treat people nicely and politely and put them into a broken system, a system that doesn't flow, a system that is unreliable, a system that has all kinds of unnecessary variation, and those people will not be happy.
Yeah.
You can put good people into a system where they're not listened to and don't have a chance to contribute, they will not be happy. If you don't think about designing the system so that it's a good place to work and people can be productive, then you are not showing respect for people. The people side and the technical side have got to be aligned.
Yeah, this is where Doyle and Strauss are correct. It's social and technical together.
Yep, that's right. So on to number 10. So this conception is, it builds on what we've just been talking about, overlap, Felipe. The idea that leadership is a title rather than a behavior. And so if we think that leadership means that decisions are made at the highest level with senior management, that leadership comes with a title, a job title, then the leadership capacity of everybody on the project to help improve things, to come up with good ideas, is belittled, is diminished. And people think that this is a soft issue. How many companies have you known that were, say, family owned, started by family, and the succession plan for leadership is that somebody's son or daughter takes over a senior position, whether they're any good at leading or even want to do that kind of work? I've seen that a number of times.
This is why statistically multi-generational family companies don't survive by the third generation.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they don't have a system in place to build those leadership skills, and the downstream generations are just a mere photocopy of the the leadership qualities that were hard won by the parents or the founders or the grandparents.
So this has all these problems we've talked about. The decision making is brought up away from where the work is happening. So instead of having the control as close to the point of variation as possible, it's taken away. It disempowers people. And when you have all these people working under separate contracts for, if you have 20 or 30 subcontractors, each of those companies has its own hierarchy, which will ultimately, because that's who pays people's salary, take precedence over the project hierarchy. So we really have to work on enabling people to work together. And then there's the municipalities we work in, and the customers and the customers' customers, and so on. We want to take away the incentive to move up just so that you finally get some damn power over your own life by creating systems in which people can, at any level, feel like they can contribute things of value. Their skill in doing their work well, and being able to be their best selves at work, to being able to move into systems of leadership with their work crew on up, and so on. That's how we're going to build really good teams and really good companies.
Yeah, this is what Deming said when he talked about one of the perils of why we're in a crisis. He said that we've got to stifle the mobility of management to move up. And I at the time when I read that, I was like, I didn't really understand it. But I think this leadership conferred with senior management title speaks to that perfectly. Like, you've got to understand the hierarchy and what kind of system is that leader making for people. This incentive to move up is really problematic if we're not in our system building up the next level.
Yeah. This, I think, for a takeaway for people who are stuck in these systems, as you and I have been in our careers, anytime somebody says, well, we have to run that up the ladder, I guess the question is why?
Yeah.
What value is the senior leadership going to make in this decision? If senior leadership has stated what the process is or what the values are that we're trying to get at, unless we're doing something that completely changes their strategy about the project, maybe they don't need to be involved, or maybe they need to come and watch what we're doing so that they are educated, rather than us having to pass something up the line that to somebody who's very divorced from what's happening on the work site in order to get an approval. So again, it says the system isn't necessarily designed to work at the level that it should. So I think of leadership as anytime somebody sees something that could be improved or that needs to be addressed or that's problematic, and they have the guts to stand up and say something and do something. That's leadership. Even if it's for 2 minutes that they're doing that, and then people respond. And if we don't encourage people to do that, then we encourage people to be mum when something's going wrong and they see it and they walk away from the job saying, nobody gives a crap about what I think. And that detracts from their ability to work and call something out the next time, and so on. So culture and norms of behavior and what we reward are incredibly important. So let's go to a concluding slide, shall we?
Yes.
All right. So again, this is the alternative thing. We need leadership at every level. People implement decisions they helped create. That's an old Doyle and Straussism. Being respected, being given the opportunity to make a difference and be recognized are much more powerful motivators than even a 5% salary raise. And critical leadership skills here are meeting management, interpersonal communication, stakeholder identification and engagement, win-win decision making, and collaborative problem solving. So with that in mind, our hope here is that people, as you understand these different ways of thinking, once you start realizing, holy crap, this stuff actually is true, and we need to look differently. Once you start seeing through lean lenses, you will not see a pile of supplies that hasn't been moved or touched in 2 weeks on your job site very differently. You'll see it as a symptom of a lack of flow. When you see people walking long distances to get something and then having to walk back, you'll see it as a problem of design of work that is creating unnecessary movement. You start seeing everything differently. And that will get you motivated to become a leader yourself and try to improve things. So understanding these principles hopefully will help you develop an underlying mental model that will see situations differently, that will cause you to make different choices than you would otherwise. And if you make better choices, you'll get better results.
And as always, we'll put a QR code for those watching this on YouTube. You can just scan the QR code with your phone or go into the video description, click on the hyperlink. I will have Victor's blog post for the 10 different problems here that we talked about today.
Misconceptions, yep.
Misconceptions, these beautiful misconceptions of a mental model. We had projects as production systems, scheduling, design, subcontractor means and methods, the lowest bid, more people working is better, wrong. Getting the materials on site, clogging your sites, wrong. More schedule detail, wrong. Subcontractors owning the people problems, wrong. And leadership being conferred with the job titles being sufficient to create a place where people want to work and contribute, also wrong. It's been awesome, Vic, going through all these with you and taking the time to really unpack these. So I super appreciate that you shared your knowledge with us. And Vic, where can people find you to get a hold of you?
Well, Ortiz Consulting Services will, maybe we can make that available to people. I didn't, yeah, I don't have a website anymore because I'm retired, except for trying to leave a legacy for people and share what I've been privileged to learn over the years. So I guess they can contact you, or they can go to Vic Ortiz, VICORTIZ at earthlink.net and reach me.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show description, and I'm happy to carrier pigeon any messages directly to you, Vic, so that you get those, because I've got Vic on speed dial, top 10. He's one of my top 10 people I call when I'm in a pinch and I need help. So yeah, thank you so much, Vic. This has been
all right. Well, this has been great fun, and I appreciate the opportunity, Felipe. It's a real service here to have the EBFC show and give us a chance to talk and share stories and principles, and I hope people enjoy this and get something out of it.
Me too. Very special thanks to my guest. I'm Felipe Engineer Manriquez. The EBFC show is created by Felipe and produced by a passion to build easier and better. Thanks for listening. Let's go build.